From Resilient Partners, this is the Resilient Insights Podcast. Every episode offers in-depth insights on the key debates and conversations shaping Washington and the world. From policy to leadership to the lighter side of life, we're your source for thoughtful discussions. So get ready to be informed, inspired, and engaged. Welcome to the Resilient Insights Podcast. I'm your guide on this journey, Joshua Baca, walking you through the intricate world of public policy, leadership, and the lighter side of life. On today's episode, I'm joined by Stephen Wieroniey, the Government Affairs Director at Huntsman Corporation, and an expert in advocacy and public affairs. We'll discuss modern advocacy strategies to drive better regulatory and legislative outcomes. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Joshua, good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Stephen, let's dive in a little bit. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became an expert in legislative and regulatory advocacy, and what are some of the things that got you to this point in your career?
I think I have a different journey to government affairs than most of the peers that you and I have dealt with in our careers. I started as a government contractor at the U.S. EPA under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And that was my first foray to government, my first professional job after graduating from the University of Maryland. And I spent about 2.5 years there at EPA working under the TSCA regulatory program and heard a lot about Congress was working on updating the program and it was outdated. It wasn't effective. It wasn't working. I got a unique experience because working with the regulators, their perception was different than the noise that was happening around TSCA. They felt that they were regulating and addressing some of the challenges with bringing chemicals to the market. So spent about 2.5 years at EPA and actually at the time was hoping to become a full-fledged EPA employee, and they were under a hiring freeze. So I started to look out into the world and was interested to learn more about how industry reacted to the TSCA program from the outside. I had a great view of how government managed the program and implemented it, but was interested to learn more about what the chemical industry thought because we heard so much about how the program wasn't working well. I dipped my toe into the trade association world and found a great job with the paint industry. They were very interested in learning more about how the program was working on the inside so they could represent their interests to Congress as the TSCA program was being reauthorized. Spent 5 years there and learned a whole host of issues related to the paint industry, product regulatory things, bringing chemicals to the market, how government reacts to chemicals that are on the market and how they manage and continue to drive improvement to formulas and how they really, at the end of the day, are regulating formulas to achieve their policy goals. I fell into a program called the California Safer Consumer Products Program that had just been passed. It was handed off to me. I had no experience with this issue, and then learned it very well because the paint industry was dealing with, and I also was aware that the spray foam industry was going through a similar challenge. Over time, I grew to know that program well and ended up at the American Chemistry Council handling this issue for the spray foam industry and got a lot of expertise on the regulatory side. ACC was kind enough to let me expand some of my legislative focus and spend some time on the Hill lobbying issues related to energy efficiency and building and construction. That's where our paths initially crossed and went full in, and then spent now 2 years at Huntsman capitalizing on all of that expertise and implementing an advocacy campaign that's helping growing the spray foam market.
It's crazy to think that you've been at the Huntsman Corporation for 2 years already. Congratulations on that milestone.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Can you explain to our listeners and viewers about what your role is at the Huntsman Corporation and what legislative advocacy looks like in your day-to-day work?
Huntsman is a great company. I've had a wonderful 2 years. Leaving the trade association world to go to corporate is a bit scary. Trade associations are a comfortable place to work, and I had no experience in the corporate world. So it was a unique opportunity. And Huntsman, when they reached out to me, they said, we know your role at the American Chemistry Council with the spray foam industry is a little bit limited because there's multiple products that ACC represents, and it can be a challenge for some of these groups to all work together to achieve policy goals. What if you came to Huntsman, set up an advocacy campaign and be proactive on issues that are important for our industry? And it was a a unique opportunity. I've never been given a blank slate like that before. Every role that I had come into was established. Here's the policy objectives. Here's what we're going to do. Huntsman gave me the pen and let me draft an advocacy strategy working with our spray foam division and go out in the world and implement it. So we spend a lot of time looking at building codes. Building codes are Byzantine. They're not as straightforward as other regulations. They fill the gap that exists between administrative law and actually giving someone instructions on what to do. Sometimes they're specific, sometimes they're vague and open to interpretation. I work closely with our spray foam business to review the code and find areas where we think the code isn't quite level for spray foam. The building code, published in 2020, was built for the fiberglass insulation industry. When we're talking about energy efficiency in the code, not the entire code in and of itself, but the energy efficiency portions of the code were built around the idea of insulating with fiberglass. That's because fiberglass was 90+% of the market when the codes were established in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. That's not the world we live in anymore. There's a lot of opportunity to level that playing field, working with both the administrative process and the legislative process.
Maybe a quick background on what Huntsman is, what you guys manufacture, and what you do.
Huntsman's a multinational chemical and material company. We're headquartered in the Woodlands, Texas. We have 3 divisions. We have a polyurethanes division, an advanced materials division, and a performance products division. We have a footprint in North America, Europe, and Asia. Our polyurethanes business is about 2/3 of our business, and the other third is split between performance products and advanced materials. Polyurethane is the product almost every person in America touches every day and probably has no idea that they're engaging with it. It's the soles of their shoes. It's the foam in their mattress. It's the foam in their couch, the foam in their upholstered furniture, the insulation in the refrigerator. Further upstream, one of the premier products in that line is an ethylene carbonate that's used for EV batteries. And we're the sole domestic producer of that product. We're very proud of that. The third is our advanced materials divisions. It's a lot of epoxy-based resins and adhesives used to bond different parts of really vehicles together. So every Boeing 70 has something like 20 tons of Huntsman material on it. And that's used to help that plane go further with less gas.
I think that there's always such a lack of information of the impact companies like Huntsman Corporation have on society. Thanks for that explanation. Let's dive into your specific goals and policy. What are some key policy goals you're currently focused on?
The major goal is to clear market barriers for the spray foam industry. To go a level deeper, we find areas where the code does not necessarily reflect how spray foam is used in a house. When you look at spray foam, when you insulate an attic, you don't put the pink fluffy stuff on the floor of the attic. You generally insulate the roof deck, the pitch of the roof, and that creates a more efficient home. But the building code requires the homes to have the same level of insulation in them, whether you have spray foam or fiberglass. We've done modeling and field data reports to determine we can lower insulation for spray foam and still meet the same energy performance of that fiberglass attic. When I came to Huntsman, I thought a lot about how I was going to build this advocacy campaign. And I knew the insulation industry was often at odds with the building industry. I found that interesting because why would a manufacturer be at odds with their customer? We can't sell insulation if a builder doesn't build a home. So the idea that we could pass all this legislation and change all this policy and it would make it harder to build homes, I don't think that's in the best interest of an insulation manufacturer. I decided to reach out to builders. We sat down and had conversations about their challenges. The portion of the building code Huntsman cares about is very small. The building code it's a fire code, it's a plumbing code, it's a mechanical code, it's a residential code, it's a commercial code. All of these pieces work together and regulate how builders build. The cost insulation adds to a home is minimal. When it's multiplied by the aggregate of every other mandate builders have to comply with, it can be a challenge. So what we decided to focus on at Huntsman was areas that we can change the code and still not hurt home affordability, or even in some cases, help home affordability. When you can get the insulation values right, you can put a smaller HVAC system in. You can put in different systems that are cheaper for the homeowner and allow the homeowner to operate that home at a better monthly cost. So that's our vision of the world, is that we try to find areas where we can clear market barriers for spray foam, but not increase costs for builders. And that's how you can get builders to support policy.
I got my start in advocacy and public affairs working in the political space. One of the first things I learned from mentors was the importance of developing coalitions. Why is it important to reach out to non-traditional allies for policy changes in the legislative and regulatory space?
A lot of policy that happens in energy efficiency really happens at the state level. And when you're in the DC bubble, Congress is always working, right? We have our 2-year sessions, but in reality, the ball is always moving. The states stop working, take a break, and all of the legislators go back and they do their day jobs. And then they come back in the fall to look at policy ideas, have planning sessions, and they start session that next January. So much work at the state level is really done prior to the opening of the legislative session. That work is complex, and what we can do is bring in the non-traditional allies into the policy discussions earlier, because the states run very short legislative cycles. State houses can't have robust policy discussions that go on for weeks, multiple committee hearings. If the work can be done and you can bring a bill to a legislator and say, hey, we have the insulation manufacturers on hand, we have the builders in agreement, we have the building code officials in agreement, we have the insulation contractors in agreement. That presents an opportunity for a policymaker to move very quickly on policy where there's strong consensus across multiple different industries. And they know there's not going to be opposition. When they only have 45 days to pass a bill, they're going to look at their list of priorities and say, well, that one has opposition, this one has opposition. They're going to set those aside, and they're going to run for the bills that they believe that they can pass. It took a session to realize how difficult that work can be and how important it is.
One of the importance of building coalitions is developing consensus. How do you go about that in your day-to-day job?
I think the most important way to develop consensus is through trust and subject matter expertise. If you go to a new potential ally and you're honest and you can build trust and you can speak about a certain policy at that expert level, I think you can help folks feel comfortable that you are bringing them an idea, a concept, a proposal that is robust, it's been vetted, and it gets a level of comfort. If someone doesn't trust you, it's hard to work with them. If you're being overly aggressive or controlling the conversation and saying my way is the best way, I think you're going to push people away from you. You can go in and say, hey, here's a concept, here's my idea.
When I started Resilient Partners, my thinking was influenced by work we did together. And some of the principles that we pitch our clients on is the importance of being proactive, being resilient in the advocacy process, and building trust. And you touch on trust being very important. In today's political environment where we're so polarized, why is collaboration with non-traditional allies more important than ever?
Well, I think one thing that we both learned in our long careers is that it's far easier to be opposed to something than to be for something.
Yep.
And when you walk in and say this piece of public policy is going to kill my business, folks pay attention to that. So if you can avoid strong opposition to a piece of public policy, you can push some of that partisanship aside. When you start talking about energy efficiency, you can work both sides of the aisle. I like to say in red states, we have an energy crisis, and in blue states, we have a climate crisis. And you can use that to your advantage to work with different parties and work with different legislators that have different goals. When we can talk to a Democrat passionate about reducing emissions and a Republican that's passionate about helping constituents reduce energy bills, spray foam is a solution to both of those. Now, we're not changing the performance of the product. We're just changing the pitch slightly and building that coalition and addressing concerns that impact stakeholders with a variety of different goals. I mean, when folks get elected to office, they have a reason that they ran, right? They wanted to solve X challenge. So our goal is to try to meet the legislator where they are and not force the legislator to come and see our position and solve their problem versus bringing them a solution and fitting a square into that round hole. We try to mold our concepts around the goals of other organizations. And I think that's been very successful for us.
Tell me more about this idea of listening. I had a separate guest on a podcast episode that's dropping later this week or early next week. And we were talking about the political landscape. And sometimes so many politicians are thinking they know what they want. How do you go about listening to what your stakeholders and your policymakers are asking for? And how does that help build consensus on the policy goals you're trying to advocate for?
First thing to do is to have that subject matter expertise, because if you walk into an office and start asking what their goals are in energy efficiency and they respond and it goes over your head and you don't have an intelligent thing to say about that concept, you look like you weren't ready to be prime time. One thing my boss has always stressed is the importance of reading the news and staying abreast of current issues. Because you never know what a legislator is going to want to talk about. You might mention, hey, what do you think about insulation? And they might say, oh, well, here's what happened in Minnesota last week.
Yeah.
And then I got to look over to my lobbyist and say, well, what happened here? You don't look like you're a master of your trade. You have a bunch of small talk, and small talk makes people comfortable. If you're good at small talk and you can get through the niceties, then you can dig down into some policy discussion.
Let's think more about Huntsman Corporation. Give an example of a successful advocacy campaign that led to a successful outcome for Huntsman.
Yeah, we had a really exciting one in California. California has a software that they use to demonstrate compliance with their energy code. And it doesn't model how spray foam works as well as it should. And we had a bunch of great data that we took to the California Energy Commission, and we couldn't get any of the bureaucrats to pick up the phone and have a meaningful conversation with us. We'd exchange some emails and they say, yeah, we understand your concern, but it's not a priority for us to look at the software this year. That went back to my time at ACC dealing with this spray foam coalition. I dusted this one off every 3 to 4 years, would come back to it. And finally, one of our builder partners said, hey, this thing in California is crushing us. Can we finally get this straightened out? So we went back to the Energy Commission for one last go at it, and we got hung up on. And we reached out to some partners in the legislature, and we ultimately passed a bill with the State House to require the CEC to look at the model, not change it, just look at it. We got that across the finish line because we worked with some local builders and we worked with the California Building Industry Association and code officials. We built a group of stakeholders that traditionally don't talk very often or traditionally are at odds. And the opposition on that bill was other insulation manufacturers because the status quo was working for their business. And any change to the status quo, they felt made their business vulnerable. And the opposition was loud, aggressive, and they were in the state and they worked the issue just as much as we did. But I think our stakeholder group was more diverse.
Success in advocacy is identifying stakeholders, listening, building consensus, and engaging. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'd add is meeting policymakers where they are.
Meeting policymakers where they are. That's a good addition.
That's a huge part of it. Ask what their goals are. Don't tell them what you think they should be doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're in a room with somebody who's asking for your advice. They want to become an expert in advocacy, want to engage in the legislative and regulatory process. What advice do you have for them on how they can engage in this field and become an expert just like you?
I think I have a great answer to that because I went through this as a novice. I didn't come up through Capitol Hill. I didn't have many years of experience when I started this. I always tell people to dig in and read as much as you can about public policy. Don't just read the proposed rule, read the preamble, read the rationale the government has put out. It helps you understand why X government agency is regulating Y issue, right? It's all there. They roll out these massive packages, hundreds of pages long, and it's easy to focus on the day-to-day impacts. But if you just focus on the changes to the law, I think you miss a bigger picture. You need to understand why government acted the way it did if you want to impart change later in the regulatory legislative process. Engage, read everything that you can, and learn from folks that are better than you. I have had a great series of mentors. No one walks into a job on day one and knows what they're doing. One of my favorite stories is when I was leaving the EP, walked to the interview for the American Coding Association, and they were still in this old building that became the Hungarian embassy. And when I walked by it, it's this gigantic building, and it's an embassy now, but it used to be the vice president's house. It's this intimidating building. And I was just this 25-year-old, 26-year-old guy walking by it. And I was like, I am not ready for whatever happened in that building. It's too big. Maybe I should go back. I convinced myself to open the door. And the door is this giant metal door. And I got met by this friendly face, and everyone was so nice. And I sat down for the interview, calmed down. I did well in the interview, but I didn't know about lobbying. They taught me everything. I had the expertise on the policy we were working on, but I didn't know some of the tools of the lobbying trade. I learned them because I asked questions and I listened, and I took advantage of people that were willing to help. One of the best things that people can do is just ask for help. I'm always willing to help. And I know, Joshua, you are too, from our time together.
Oh, yeah.
You just got to knock on someone's door and ask. People are willing to help.
I think that goes very understated in our field today. Much of what we do is art, not science. And talking to people who've been engaged in the process. My story is not too dissimilar from yours. When I started in politics, they said, read as much as you can, learn to articulate what you read in a concise manner, and be able to write. I think in the advocacy space today, that kind of holds true. You have, just as you mentioned, you got to read the bills, you got to read the regulations, you got to then go figure out what they mean, and you got to be able to articulate them, both verbally and in a written capacity. Any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I need to thank my wife for letting me use her office. I realized that I should have said that at the top of the call. Folks are probably looking around thinking that I'm really into the Michelin Man. My wife runs federal affairs for Michelin, so that's where all the great regalia comes from. So I do need to thank my wife, Jenny, who's let me use her office.
Let's wrap this up. We curate a playlist from the Resilient Insights podcast. Songs that capture our mood, songs that define resilience in your life. Give me a song today that captures your mood.
My first reaction was my old boss, Lee Salamoni's favorite song is I Won't Back Down from Tom Petty. And when I think of lobbying, I think that's an important piece and it plays well with your podcast. So I'm going to steal that one. I won't back down. It's about resiliency and keeping up with life. You got to wake up every day and be ready. If you give up before the job's done, life is going to beat you up every time, right? You got to stay strong and be resilient. Keep fighting the good fight, whatever that fight is.
Amen, brother. That's a good song to add to the list. Stephen, where can people find more information about you? Are you available on LinkedIn?
Yeah, on LinkedIn. My email address is out in the ether. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. There aren't many Wieronies on LinkedIn, so you type that in and you'll find me.
Stephen, thank you for being on the Resilient Insight podcast. To all our listeners and viewers, give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast. As a reminder, you can listen on streaming platforms or watch on YouTube. Stephen, until next time, keep listening.
Thanks, Joshua. Take care.
And I just can't see